Good morning, everyone. How are we? That's good. This morning I'm going to be speaking to you about one of the greatest boys' own adventurers of the 20th century, and that was the Kon Tiki Expedition. And this was when a group of 6 Scandinavian men, 5 Norwegians and a Swede constructed a raft made of balsa wood logs. And their plan was to drift or voyage across the Pacific Ocean from South America to the Polynesian islands. And it was all about trying to prove a theory that perhaps migration had happened into the Pacific from South America instead of the other, more current thinking at the time that they came from Central Asia. Now, this theory that had been espoused was completely against the theories of the time. Everyone thought at the time that the people of Polynesia had migrated down from Central Asia through the Philippines, Indonesia, and then over the thousands of years out into the Polynesian islands of the South Pacific. But one man questioned all that, and that was a man by the name of Thor Heyerdahl. He was born in 1914 to some affluent parents who were both academics. He went to the University of Oslo and studied nature and zoology there. And then in his early 20s, he went and lived on the beautiful island of Fatahilva with his first wife, Liv, and they stayed there for 2 years. This is in the Marquesas group of islands in French Polynesia. And while he was there, he had studied these islands before he went there, and he knew the conventional wisdom at the time that these people were the descendants of people that had migrated from from west to east through to the Polynesian islands. But as he was sitting on this island, he could see that the prevailing winds came from the east towards the west, from South America towards these islands. The prevailing currents also came that way. He could walk along the beach with his wife Liv, and they often stumbled across flotsam and jetsam that had been washed up on the beach. And often this had Spanish writing on it, had it come from South America. He also noticed that a lot of the crops on this island were native to the Americas. Things like sweet potato grew readily on the island, but they were native plants from the Americas. So how had they got there? So he did some more investigating, and he studied South American Indian culture. This was pre-Christopher Columbus times. And he realized that the gods that those ancient Indians in South America had worshipped were very, very similar to the gods that were worshipped on the island where he was staying. He went and spoke to some of his local chieftains in the villages, and they told stories that had been passed down from generation to generation to generation over thousands of years about how the great sun god Tiki had guided his people all the way across this vast ocean from the east to the west, not the other way around. He did some investigation to the Spanish conquistadors after their conquest of South America, and he came across drawings and logs which showed these magnificent huge vessels that the local Indians had constructed. It gave details about these vessels made from balsa wood logs and about how they were constructed. And could these have been the vessels that would transported these people from South America to French Polynesia? So he ended up writing a paper, a scientific paper, espousing this theory that migration had happened from South America. And when that was published in a scientific magazine in Norway, it received terrible reviews. The scientific community at the time ridiculed this finding and this theory of Heyerdahl's. They said he was a young upstart who was trying to make a name for himself, and that's all it was. He was trying to cause controversy, and we all know that these men had come from Asia through the Pacific that way. But it's not a bad theory. During the war, he was going to try and prove his theory by building a raft and proving his theory, but then the war broke out, and he served with the Norwegian government in exile in London during the war until 1944, where he joined the Norwegian Free Forces and fought with them. But as I said, it's not a bad theory because the Polynesian islands, or the French Polynesian islands, are closer to South America than any other continent. So why couldn't, and as I said, the currents and the winds go that way, so why couldn't these people have come that direction? And he wasn't the only person to have theories about Polynesia. When Captain James Cook made his first voyage of discovery into the Pacific, he visited Tahiti. And when he was there, he met a high priest there by the name of Tupia. And Tupia told Cook about these islands that were thousands of miles away across the seas. And he said that these Tahitian seamen had ventured to all of these islands, and people spoke the same languages in this island. And he produced a map, which is now famous as the Tupia map, showing Cook where these places were. And Cook didn't believe this for a second. I mean, how could this native, this uneducated native with no scientific equipment, with no navigational equipment whatsoever, know where these places were, let alone be able to venture to them just using the stars and the tides and things that they'd seen in the ocean? There was no way. And it was actually Sir Joseph Banks, who was travelling with Cook on that first voyage of exploration, who paid for Tupia to go on board the Endeavour and sail with Cook during that first voyage. And eventually Cook came around because he did travel to these islands. Tupia said, okay, travel that way for 6 days and you'll come across this island. And he did. And when he got there, Cook was even more surprised by the fact that Tupia could converse with the local natives there. The dialects were very, very similar. And even when he got as far as New Zealand, the Tupia was able to converse with the Maori in New Zealand, which was incredible for Cook. And so perhaps there was something going on here. Tupia was, as I said, he was a high priest. He became very popular in New Zealand. Cook anchored in the Bay of Islands at the North Island of New Zealand. Tupia went ashore into what was now known as Tupia's Cave, and he stayed there for several weeks, and each day maidens would come and visit him and bring him food. And when the maiden would leave the next morning, she was no longer a maiden, if you know what I mean. And a lot of people in New Zealand can trace their heritage back to Tupia, which was pretty interesting. But Tupia actually died of sickness on that very first voyage of discovery around the South Pacific. But during his third voyage of discovery into the Pacific, Cook once again called in at Tahiti, and another high priest told him about this group of islands that was many, many, many days to the north. And once again, Cook thought, I better investigate this. He travelled north over the equator and he discovered what we now know as the Hawaiian Islands. And he decided that these people, the linguistic capabilities of these people, the similarities of these people were so great that he should create a nation known as Polynesia, which means people of many islands. That's what it translates to. And so that the famous Polynesian Triangle was formed, with Hawaii in the north, New Zealand in the south, and Easter Island out in the east. And Cook decided that he wanted this to be one nation, and he was working towards making this the one nation of Polynesia. And if he had been successful, it would have been the largest nation in the world in terms of area, bigger than the United States, Canada, and Russia combined, so a huge nation. But he was obviously killed in Hawaii before he could bring this to fruition. Now, after the war, Heidel decided that he was going to prove his theory, and he recruited a group of men, or a crew, to come on this voyage of discovery with him. Now, the first of these men he recruited was a man by the name of Erik Hesselberg, which was their navigator and their artist. Not a navigator in the terms of he would tell them where to go, because they had no choice, as I'll explain later on, where they were going to go. He was going to use sextants and things to tell them where they were so they could report that to other people. He was born in 1914. He was a childhood friend of Heidel. They grew up quite close to each other, but he was the only professional sailor with any sailing experience aboard the Kon Tiki. In fact, Heidel himself couldn't swim during the voyage. He wrote the book Kon Tiki and I in 1949. It was translated into 15 languages. In my first talk, after we left Fremantle, I mentioned that Matthew Flinders had been inspired to go to sea after reading Robinson Crusoe. Well, it was Kon Tiki and I for me. I love this book. I devoured it when I was a kid. I still read it quite often, so I love this book, and that inspired me to go and have a life at sea. He became a renowned artist. He built his own yacht in the Mediterranean, which he named Kon Tiki, and he sailed that yacht between France, Italy and Spain for 11 years. He had great friends, including people like Pablo Picasso, who mourned him when he died. That's the book itself. The second man on board was a man by the name of Bengt Danielsson. Now, Heidel originally wanted to have an all-Norwegian crew, but Danielsson was a Swede. He couldn't find anyone in Norway who had the skills and was prepared to come on the voyage with him. And Danielsson was prepared to do all the cooking on the voyage. But the other skill that he had was that he could speak Spanish, and he was the only one of the party who could, and that was going to hold him in good stead as they tried to negotiate with Peruvian officials and tried to get the raft constructed. After the expedition, he and his wife, Therese Maries, lived on the island of Raoa, where the raft eventually ended up, and for 3 years from 49 to 52. He wrote a lot of books. He did screenplays. He was a technical advisor on the Rodgers and Hammerstein movie South Pacific. He became one of the world's foremost experts in French Polynesia, and he was appointed as the Swedish Consul to French Polynesia from 1961 to 78, which has got to be the best gig in the world, you'd think, wouldn't you? Another man on the mission was Knut Hordland. Now, you could spend half an hour speaking about this man himself. I mean, an incredible man. He was a Norwegian war hero. He had joined the Norwegian resistance when the Nazis invaded Norway. He had been captured twice by the Gestapo, but he escaped both times. He made his way through Sweden and escaped to England, where he was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, or the SOE, which is the forerunner of MI6. And they trained him in things like radio craft, demolitions, parachuting, espionage, basically. And then he was to be dropped back into Norway to be involved in sabotage operations there. But the most famous operation he was involved in was the attack on the Norsk hydro plant. Now, this was a hydroelectric plant that was producing heavy water for the Germans. Heavy water is necessary in the construction of atomic weapons, and the Germans, this was the main source of heavy water for the Germans, and the Allies wanted it destroyed. They couldn't destroy it through precision bombing because it was surrounded by mountains and it was too hard to get to. They could probably do some damage to it through carpet bombing, but there was a village located right nearby, and the Norwegian government in exile forbade the British to try and carpet bomb this place because many civilians would have been killed during the bombing. So something else had to be done, and it was planned that a commando raid would take place. So Horgland and 3 companions were supposed to parachute into Norway and identify a landing place for gliders full of British commandos to land where they could attack the plant and destroy it. But while they were making their way by aircraft from England to Norway, the plane was attacked by a fighter. Horgland and 3 of his companions had to parachute out of the plane early without taking any of their equipment, no radios, no food, and no skis. And they landed 100 miles away from the rendezvous with the Norwegian resistance. And it took them 8 days of walking through the snow and the ice in freezing conditions to reach the rendezvous point. And by the time they got there, they were starving, they were in terrible condition, they were exhausted, and it took them a couple of weeks to recover from that. And once they did, they went to work, and they identified a site where the gliders could land nearby to the factory. But by that time, they were getting deeper and deeper into the Norwegian winter, and conditions weren't very good at all. But the British needed this place destroyed. So 3 gliders full of commandos took off, being towed by other aircraft. And when they came to near the rendezvous point, one of the gliders was cut free. But as soon as it was cut free, the heavy winds, the high winds at the time, made the glider go out of control. And it crash landed, killing many of the commandos and wounding many others. When the other aircraft commanders saw what had happened, they aborted the mission and returned to England. Now, the surviving commandos were captured by the Germans under Hitler's orders. If a commando was captured behind enemy lines, they would be executed, and that's what happened. These surviving commandos were taken out and they were shot. But this had warned the Germans that the British intended or were trying to destroy this factory. So they made reinforcements and more fortifications to the factory. So in the end, another team of Norwegian saboteurs were dropped in and joined forces with Haugland's team. And they did what was considered to be absolutely impossible. Carrying their equipment and explosives and weapons, they were able to rappel down one side of this huge deep ravine. The only way to get to this fort was across a narrow bridge, a steel bridge, atop a very, very deep ravine. And this bridge was heavily guarded by the Germans. But Haugland and his men clambered down the side of the ravine, rappelled down there. In the dead of night of Norwegian winter, they crossed a fast-flowing stream at the bottom of the ravine, getting through there. And then they were able to climb up the other side of the ravine, which the Germans considered to be absolutely impossible. But they did it. They were guided into the factory by a Norwegian resistance collaborator, and they were able to plant explosives there. They also planted some British weapons and backpacks and haversacks, indicating to the Germans that this was a British operation and not a Norwegian one, and so the Germans wouldn't take any reprisals against the local civilian population. The plant was blown up, and the heavy water production for Germany ceased for several months, putting them on the back burner, and obviously the Germans never developed an atomic weapon. But there was a movie made about this. You might have seen it, The Heroes of Telemark, with Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris. Haugland hated this movie. He said it was wildly inaccurate, it had nothing to do with what they did, so he produced another show called The Real Heroes of Telemark, and you can see that on YouTube, and it's a much better thing to watch. He was awarded Norway's highest decoration for military gallantry, which was the War Cross with Sword, twice. This is the equivalent of the Victoria Cross twice, so an amazing effort. He was dropped back into Norway several times during the war, carrying out espionage operations and sabotage operations behind enemy lines. He also received the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Medal, several French awards, including the Legion of Honour and the American Medal of Freedom. After the Kon Tiki Expedition, he went on to have an incredible diplomatic career, and he was also awarded many more awards. And people say I've got a good memory, but I can't remember all these, so I'll have to read them to you, I'm sorry. He was made a Knight of the First Class Order of the Vasa, a Knight First Class of the Order of Dannenberg. Try and keep track of the different countries here. He was made a Knight of the Icelandic Order of the Falcon, First Class Cross of the Federal Republic of Germany's Order of Merit, Commander of the Belgian Order of Leopold, a Companion of the Order of the Crown of Thailand, an Officer of the Iranian Order of the Lion and the Sun. He received the Grand Decoration of Honour in gold for services to the Republic of Austria, the Peruvian Order of Merit for distinguished service. He was made a Knight First Class of the Order of St. Olive, and he also received the Defence Medal with 3 stars. He was also the director of the Kon Tiki Museum from 1947 to 1990. So he's the sort of guy that you really wouldn't want to have to introduce at a function, at a formal function, because it would take forever to be able to go through all that. And the medals he would have to wear, would really weigh you down. The other radio operator who went on this, and the other reason that, just back to Haugland for a second. The reason that Heidel wanted Haugland along on this mission was because of his profile. Heidel knew that if Haugland came along, everyone in Norway would know about this expedition, and everyone would be following it. They'd receive a lot more sponsorship and support for the mission. But the other radio operator was a man by the name of Torsten Rabi. He was also a Norwegian resistance hero. He stayed behind enemy lines once again, and he radioed back to British intelligence the location and details of German warships that were hiding in Norwegian fjords during the war. And on one occasion, he was in a village which was surrounded by mountains, and he couldn't get his radio traffic out. It was the surrounding topography made it impossible for the signal to get out. So he actually wired his radio set to the aerial of a German officer's radio set who was billeted next door, and that was the way he got that signal out. He He reported on the position of the great German battleship, the Tirpitz, which meant that the RAF could come over and bomb the ship, damaging it severely, and the Tirpitz had no impact on the war whatsoever. So, remarkable man. He was also awarded Norway's highest honour, the War Cross with Swords. After the expedition, he became a little bit of a recluse. He went to live on a place called Bear Island in the Arctic Circle. And there was all these rumours that he was involved with listening posts, listening in on the Soviet military traffic up there. But we can't prove that. But he died during an expedition in 1964 in Canada's Northwest Territories, where he was trying to ski to the North Pole. The last member of the party was a man by the name of Herman Watzinger, and isn't that a great photo? He was second in command of the expedition. He was in charge in the construction of the raft, which I'll go through in a minute, and he was also in charge about all the experiments, which I'll touch on in a minute as well. He went on to have a remarkable business career in South America, and he was awarded the Peruvian Medal of Honor as well. So the raft itself, I remember when I was growing up as a kid, we used to be able to go and buy packets of balsa wood. And you'd be able, it was a very light, very brittle sort of wood. You would cut it out using a Stanley knife. There was always a pro forma in there where you could cut out something and make it into a plane, and you'd be able to fly these little planes around the place. But balsa wood is actually classed as a hardwood. It's the softest of all the hardwoods, but it's still classed as a hardwood. It fills up with oil. It's got a lot of oil in the wood, which makes it, protects itself from water, which makes it very good for use in a raft. And before the war, there was forest after forest after forest of these huge balsa wood trees all the way down the west coast of South America. But after the war, a lot of these forests were decimated to help with their reconstruction needs in Europe. So a lot of the forests were cut down. So to try and find these trees, Heidel and his men had to travel 100 miles up a Peruvian river before they found trees that were big enough. They had to wait for the full moon, which was when most of the oil, would maximise the amount of oil that were in these logs, and then they cut them down, and with the help of the Peruvian Navy, they floated them down this 100 miles of river out into the sea and to a Peruvian Navy base where they were able to put the raft together. And the main part of the raft was 9 logs, 9 huge 14-metre logs that were 2 feet in diameter, and this was going to be the base or the hull of this raft. And they were connected to each other by hemp rope. There was no modern nails or anything else used. It was all technology that was available to the Indians pre-Christopher Columbus. And so they made miles and miles of hemp rope themselves, the crew and also volunteers from the Peruvian Navy. And then they cut grooves in the logs as well to try and keep these logs as close to each other as possible, and practicing their knots there as well. And then across the 9 logs were placed other balsa wood logs were about 5.5 metres long and about a foot in diameter, and this was to brace the internal part of the raft, keep it all together, give it stability. And these were placed every 3 feet along the raft. And then over the top of that was placed a bamboo deck. And in that bamboo deck had trapdoors, so that you could open a trapdoor, and that space between the bottom logs and the lateral logs, there was space in there so that stores could be food and water and other provisions could be stored in there out of the way. And then there was a hut built or a cabin built on top of that deck. And there was a mast built. The mast was about 29, 30 feet high, and it was an A-frame mast. So it was attached to both sides of the Kon Tiki and just went up in an A-frame. So it couldn't be moved, which meant that when the sail was attached to that, which was about a 4 metre square sail attached to that, this raft was only going in one direction. the way the wind was pushing it and the tide was pushing it. It's not like a modern sailboat where you could adjust the mainsail or the spinnaker and you could turn the boat around. This sail was fixed in place, so it was only going one way. There was an oar on the back of the boat, but this was only used for trying to it couldn't steer the vessel at all. It could only be used to try and keep the back of the boat square onto the prevailing waves as they came towards the back of the boat. So this is a pretty good idea of the boat, the raft itself. Gives you a pretty good idea with the oar out the back. So they set sail from Callao in Peru on the 28th of April 1947. Now, before they left, they had to sign waivers from the Peruvian government. The Peruvians thought this was crazy, that these guys were crazy and they were unlikely to survive more than a couple of weeks. This raft would fall apart after that time. So they had to sign waivers acknowledging the Peruvian government had warned them against going and that there was no responsibility placed on the government. And then the Peruvian Navy towed them out past the shipping lane, so they weren't going to be a danger to or interfere with the commercial shipping along there. And then they were cut free and they were on their own. And for the first month, they travelled in a northeasterly direction, which confused them a bit. They expected to go straight out into the Pacific. But after that first month, they started travelling over the Pacific towards the west. And this is the relevant current. This is the Humboldt current that is the current that goes all the way across the Pacific Ocean. As I said before, they were doing some experiments. Their main sponsor on this journey turned out to be the US Navy. Obviously, this was only a couple of years after the end of the war, and during the war, the US Navy had a lot of downed airmen who had been stuck in life rafts. They had a lot of ships that were sunk and sailors who had been adrift at sea. And so they're looking for ways for those men to be able to survive easier if they were shot down again. So they did some experiments, including things like a powder that the Navy supplied, which if you put into a balloon and you put in some seawater into that balloon, it would produce hydrogen and inflate the balloon. So if you were in a little life raft on your own after you're being shot down, you could inflate this balloon and the balloon would be much easier to see in the sky rather than a pinprick in the ocean. So that was one experiment. They also did some experiments mixing different amounts of seawater with fresh water, trying to work out the best formula about how much seawater you could consume without becoming sick, how much fresh water to add to it so that you could replenish the salts that you'd lost out of your body through sweat. They did some experiments where they caught fresh fish, and if you catch a fish that's fresh enough, you can open up the lymph glands on that fish, and because the seawater has gone through those lymph glands, it's been purified and the water is actually fresh, so you can drink that water out of the lymph glands, although I've never tried that. They were given US Navy survival rations as well, and two of the men were told that they had to use these survival rations and not use anything else. So at the end of the experiment, they wanted to see what sort of condition they were in compared to the other four men on board the vessel. So there's lots of things like that. They also made two new discoveries of fish, including the firefly squid, which is a squid that followed the boat during the evening, and you could see them at night. And this was a squid that glows in the dark, similar to a firefly. And they discovered this species. Here's some photos of life aboard the Kon Tiki. Heidel doing some administrative work, Danielsson doing some cooking there, doing some steering with looks like some heavy seas out the back there. And these are the two radio operators using the radios, trying to repair the radios by looking at valves there. So the radios were fairly controversial. After the expedition, when they actually made landfall, a lot of people said that this wasn't a true experiment whatsoever because you had radios on board, you had sextants on board, you had charts on board, you knew where you were and where you were headed to. It wasn't like you were going into the unknown like the Indians would have had to do if they'd made this journey. But Heidel countered that by saying he was out to prove that the raft could actually make it. All these things that were added to the raft were only incidental. They were just things there to help along the way. They had no real impact on the actual voyage itself. And the world was looking for news. I mean, these men would radio back using Morse code. They were in contact with operators in the US and in Hawaii and later on in New Zealand. And the world waited with bated breath for news of what was happening on the Kon Tiki. These were, as I said, straight after World War II. The world was looking for heroes, and these were 6 handsome Scandinavian men who were on a boy's own adventure of discovery in the Pacific. Newspapers all throughout Europe, and especially in Scandinavia, waited every day for news about what was happening, and ham radio operators all around the world tuned in their sets to their frequency, trying to listen in on the conversations as well as they were transpiring. And this is some more some life aboard the raft. It looks pretty comfortable, doesn't it? The main source of food that they had was obviously fish, and their favourite fish was the dolphin fish, or maui maui, as we sometimes call it as well. They used to love eating this fish, but also Danielsson used to be able to walk around the deck of the Kon Tiki in the morning, and he was able to usually pick up flying fish that had come over the top of the vessel during the night, hit the hut and fall onto the deck. And he was able to pick them up every morning and use them in his meals as well. So there was an abundance of fish. There was also an abundance of sharks. Now, the sharks followed this vessel all the way through the voyage. In fact, on one occasion early in the voyage, the deck of the boat, especially at the back of the boat, which had waves coming over the back of it, was very, very slippery. And Hesselberg slipped one day and fell into the water. Now, as I said, you couldn't steer this boat. You couldn't stop the boat. There was no way the vessel was going to be able to turn around and go back and get him. So it was Haugland, the resistance hero, who immediately grabbed one end of a rope, dived into the ocean, swam towards Hesselberg, while the other members of the crew scrambled around trying to find the other end of that rope and secure it. And he only reached Hesselberg when there was only a couple of metres of rope to spare. So very, very lucky. And Hesselberg later swore that as they were being pulled back towards the boat, he felt 2 sharks bump against them as they were being dragged back on board. So a very, very scary experience. But they had a hate-hate relationship with these sharks. It was very hot and humid aboard the boat travelling through the South Pacific, of course. They would love to have jumped in the water and gone for a swim, tied a rope and jumped in the water and clambered back on board. But they couldn't do it because of these sharks. So they decided to do something about them and have a big cull. And over a period of 3 hours one day, they hauled in 9 sharks in 3 hours. The trouble is, what do you do with 9 sharks? You can't leave them there to rot. You're not going to be able to eat all the meat from 9 sharks. They're big animals. So the only thing you could really do was throw them back overboard, which attracted more sharks. So it wasn't a really fruitful sort of exercise. They invented one of the very first shark cages. Now you can imagine that these are 9 balsa wood logs, independent logs tied together by just rope. And so as you're going through the waves, through the swell, each of these logs would move all the time. And so they'd loosen and stretch those ropes. The ropes had to be adjusted and tightened every single day. Had to be checked all the time. They were worried about these ropes rotting and disintegrating and the logs coming apart. But they couldn't see the logs and the ropes beneath the boat. And they couldn't dive in and have a look with all these sharks about. So they invented one of the very first shark cages. And this was just a bamboo or a wicker basket that they'd kept coconuts in. And they put up 4 bamboo posts at each of the corners, and then they tied some rope around that to give the appearance of being some sort of a cage. And then they lowered that into the water, and someone got in there with goggles and snorkel and was able to peer underneath the bottom of the boat and check the ropes and the logs underneath there. But it's really not something that I'd really like to do with all these sharks hanging around the ship. The biggest shark that they encountered, though, was a whale shark one day. Now, they had never seen or heard of anything like this. This is the biggest fish in the ocean. When it came alongside the Kon Tiki, which was 14 metres long, this shark was bigger than the Kon Tiki. They were terrified. They had no idea what this was. They thought that with one flick of its tail, they had no idea that it was a plankton-eating thing. It wasn't it didn't eat flesh at all. They thought that with one flick of its tail, this thing could break up the Kon Tiki itself. They'd be flung into the water and they'd be devoured by this huge shark. So they didn't know what to do. Eventually, Haugland picked up a harpoon that they had on board, and he stabbed the shark with that harpoon. It didn't do much damage to the shark. It just seemed to look at them and say, well, you're not very friendly, and it swam off and never came back again. There were some great milestones along this voyage, and after 45 days they reached the halfway mark of the journey, so they were 2,500 nautical miles away from any land. They were making around about 42.5 nautical miles, or about 80 kilometres per day during the voyage. And on day 93 they spotted land. They spotted one of the islands of the Marquesas group for the first time. And then 4 days later they received visitors. They'd been passing by another island, and the natives on this island had seen this raft go by. And you're thinking, what would they have thought of that? I mean, were these survivors of a shipwreck or something? So these natives rowed out in the canoes to see what was going on and see if they could be of any help. But they were told that everything was fine. And then on day 101, which was the 7th of August 1947, they were coming towards an island, and they realised that they were going straight for this island. They weren't going around it at all. They were going to land on this island, which was Raoa. And so Rabi got on the radio to New Zealand. He informed them that where they were, and he told them that if you don't hear from us within 36 hours, please send help. And then they lashed everything down, secured everything as tightly as possible. They lashed themselves to the Kon Tiki itself, and then over the next few minutes they were carried on waves. They surfed down the front of waves, had no control over the vessel whatsoever. And then finally they were picked up by a huge wave, and they were taken over the outer reef of Raoa Island, and they were planted right on top of the inner reef of the island. And very, very luckily for them, the raft didn't break up. It stayed intact, and it was stuck fast on that inner reef. And they were able to just walk off the front of the raft into knee-deep water and wade over to Raoa Island through the lagoon there. And over the next couple of hours, they were able to take all their equipment off the raft, radio back to New Zealand, informing them that they were safe and where they were, and asking that a ship be sent to come and collect them because they were going no further. At high tide, they were able to go out and they were able to refloat the Kon Tiki and bring it ashore with them as well, so they were able to save the raft. Now, that's Raoa Island. Not such a bad place to be shipwrecked. There's worse places you could be, isn't there? So they stayed on there for a week before they were transferred over by ship to another inhabited island. But their adventure hadn't finished. While they were on that island, it became necessary to perform an operation on a small child. So they received instructions via radio from New Zealand on to how to perform this operation, and they were able to administer this operation and help this young native boy. And then the Kon Tiki was picked up and it was towed to Tahiti, where it was put on a ship and taken to Oslo, and it sits at the Kon Tiki Museum in Oslo to this day. Now, after this, they were international heroes. They went to the White House. They presented President Truman with a flag that they had taken with them during this journey. They appeared in lots of newsreels and did lots of media interviews. This is a photo of a reunion they had in Tahiti several years later. So they were famous all over the world. And Heidel produced a documentary in 1951 about the journey, and it won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1951, and that Academy Award is also on display at the Kon Tiki Museum in Oslo. Now, last year we were invited to go to the Kon Tiki Museum and meet with Thor Heidel Jr., his son, and he gave us a backstage or a behind-the-scenes tour of the museum, and it was absolutely incredible. He's a lovely, lovely guy. He was in his father's shadow as a youth for a long time. It would have been very hard for him growing up with the same name as his father, but became a marine biologist in his own right, had a very successful career, and he actually was an advisor to his father on some of the other expeditions that he went on down the track. So we were very grateful for that. Now, as I said before, the Kon Tiki inspired me in my naval career, but it also inspired a lot of other people. And in the 80s, a group of adventurers decided that they'd recreate this voyage. They built a very similar raft to the Kon Tiki, but they named it the Balsa. And they built it in Chile, and they spent 161 days travelling all the way across the Pacific Ocean to Queensland. And when they got to the Queensland coast, they were 9 nautical miles off the Queensland coast, the authorities said, no, that's enough. We don't trust you in the shipping channel. So they were towed into Mooloolaba, our home basically, where Lee and I come from. And they were towed into an area that was in Mooloola River, which was opposite where the present-day yacht club stands now. And this, at the time, was just vacant land. There was nothing there. The authorities thought that this would be a great place for them to be quarantined, where they wouldn't be able to affect anyone else, and they could stay there for 30 days in quarantine. But the authorities soon found out that quarantines don't work all that well in Queensland, because the locals thought that these blokes deserved a beer after all this travel. So they would go down every day with their eskies and their ice boxes and take beers down to them. And the local ladies thought that even though these boys had long hair and they looked a bit rugged, they were skinny as rakes and they were a long way from home, so they deserved a home-cooked meal. So every night they would be hosted at different houses around the region having home-cooked meals. And then a concrete contractor came down to the area. He had some spare concrete. He dumped it on the ground and asked these men to put their footprints into the concrete. And you can still go to La Balsa Park on the Sunshine Coast, because it's named after the raft, and see where these footprints are in 1970. We'll place there in 1970. And La Balsa Park is one of our favourite places to go to for a picnic or a barbecue or just a few drinks and watch the world go by. So if you're ever on the Sunshine Coast, I can highly recommend it. But was he right? Did people actually migrate from South America to the Pacific Islands, or was it the other way around? In fact, no. He proved that they could have, and maybe some did. But carbon dating testing and DNA testing have proven through the years that peoples of that area did in fact originate in Taiwan, of all places, and then migrate through over thousands of years through what we now know as the Philippines, Indonesia, through Melanesia and Micronesia, out into what we now know as Polynesia. So, but all the same, it was a great adventure. He went on some more adventures. In 1955, he went over to Easter Island to do some work there and study the moai, the great stone statues that had been placed there. And he learnt more there than anyone had known before. He worked out how these great stone monoliths had been transported around the island. He wrote the best-selling book Aku Aku about his experiences there. And this was the first adventure that his son had gone with him on. And then in 69 and 70, he created 2 more rafts made of papyrus reeds. And he sailed the Ra 1 from Morocco, but it became waterlogged after a while and they had to tow it back. And then the Ra 2 in 1970, and that made it all the way from Morocco to Barbados. So proving that great transition through the seas could have taken place as well. And then in 1977, he built another raft, which is also on display the Ra 2 is on display at the Kon Tiki Museum as well. He built the Tigris and sailed all the way from Iraq to Pakistan. And then he famously burnt this raft, this great raft, in protest about all the wars and the terrorism that was happening in the region at the time. And after that, he became quite outspoken, an advocate for peace in the region and for protecting the environment. He died on April 26, 2002, and all of Norway mourned his death. He once said, "Borders, I have never seen one, but I've heard that they exist in the minds of some men." So I think that's a pretty good quote to end this on. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of the Kon Tiki Expedition. I hope you've enjoyed it. I don't know when I'll be back, but I'll be back in a few days' time, and I'll be talking to you about ghost ships, some of the great phantom ships of the ocean. And hopefully we can all work together. Yeah, you said it, not me. Hopefully we can all work together and we can solve what is one of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time. So I hope to see you then.